It's a library. Shh. Good evening, I'm Tony Marks. I'm the president of the New York Public Library. To those of you in the room and to those of you watching online, thank you so much for being with you. Well, it says here we're proud to present a conversation, and we are, though I'll be honest, I wish we didn't have this topic to discuss. But we do, so we must. Have this conversation about free expression and the freedom to read, essential values to this library and to our society. And tonight, for that discussion, we have two of our most vital writers working today, Akhtar and Imani, and they'll be speaking with the executive editor of The Atlantic, Adrienne LaFrance. We're here together in the middle of Banned Book Week. It's been a long week already, because there's much work to be done to draw the attention of the country to the alarming rise of book banning. The numbers are soaring, and of course, most of the books being targeted are by or about LGBTQ people and people of color, aimed at teens who are trying to find their identity. These efforts we've seen before, of ideologues feeding the frenzy of fear around their followers in order to impose a sense of enforced conformity, to exclude narratives and peoples that do not fit a master narrative, a narrative of monoculture. We know how important it is to fight against those trends, and history has proven it over and over again. Everyone needs to be able to read what they want. They need to be able to find themselves in literature, to know that they're not alone, to find others in literature so that we can learn about each other and live with each other, because we have no choice but to do so, and in fact must celebrate doing so rather than squash, deny, reject. Everyone must discover for themselves as widely as possible. Parents can help guide their children and should, but no one has a right to tell me or my children, you or your children, what they can and can't read. We've just had a day of action around this. We were with the mayor yesterday around this. Throughout the library system, we've launched a set of programs to continue throughout the year. A national teen banned book club, where anyone in the country can get access to these titles and then join a club to talk with their peers and meet with the authors and find themselves and find others. We are extending access to other banned books through our Simply E app, our digital ebook reader. And if you don't have it, you should load it. And of course, events like tonight. You can learn more at our website, nypl.org/booksforall, one word. And of course, tonight's events is a partnership with The Atlantic magazine. Since 1857, The Atlantic has been challenging assumptions and pursuing truth, two things that we will be doing tonight together. And I couldn't be more proud to be here with the leadership of The Atlantic, Jeff Goldberg and Adrienne, who we'll hear from. They are doing extraordinary work with one of the great platforms of truth and discussion that the United States has produced. Tonight's event is also generously sponsored by the College Board, doing difficult and heroic work to ensure college access, especially to those who aren't finding it so easy. And it's a pleasure to be doing this in partnership, particularly with the CEO of the College Board, my old friend David Coleman. At the end of tonight's conversation, the panel will take a few questions. You'll find cute little cards and pencils. You may have felt them when you sat down. You can write your question. My colleagues will come and collect. If you're online, you can submit your question on the chat or email publicprograms, one word, publicprograms, plural, at nypl.org. And now, join me in welcoming Adrienne LaFrance, Ayad Akhtar, and Imani Perry.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Tony, for those lovely remarks. Most fired up I've ever felt at a library, possibly. And thank you all so much to you for being here. And of course, Imani and Ayad for coming and having this conversation with me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to start by asking you both to respond to this question, which is a casual conversation, but I do want to hear what you both think for my first question, which is, in both of your writing, there is a theme over and over, you both explore a theme of America as sort of a foreign place or a foreign country, either foreign because there's a contradiction between stated ideals and how we actually live, or foreign because of how you have to navigate your way through society. And I'm curious to hear you talk about, when you look at what's happening with regard to, the banning of books, challenges to free expression, does this to you feel foreign, or does it feel like what you expect in this country?
All right.
Imani's going to go first.
I'll begin. So I'll say, first of all, it's lovely to be here. Coming out of my particular tradition, it doesn't feel foreign. It feels quite consistent with much of the history of this country. When I think about book banning, and there's so many different ways in which it has, existed in global history. I think specifically of the prohibition of reading for the enslaved, and the idea that literacy would make people bad slaves. And so, the conception that part of the history of the cruelest forms of subjugation in American history was predicated on keeping people ignorant and out of books. And that so much of the freedom struggle, particularly in the context of the antebellum period, was about literacy. There's this beautiful sort of tradition of association between freedom and literacy for African Americans. And so I would say it doesn't feel foreign, but it feels like part of a very old battle about sort of who can fully occupy the position of a sort of member of society, not just sort of with access to rights, but to be a kind of member of the deliberative body, the intellectual community. So yeah, it doesn't feel foreign, but it feels like an exhausting battle to continue to have to wage.
I want to go back to that, but first I want to hear Ayad's answer.
I mean, thank you for inviting me and for being here. And by the way, let me be the one on stage to congratulate Imani, the extraordinary honor from yesterday. So,
thanks.
For those who don't know what he's referring to, she's just been awarded a MacArthur grant, but they're both geniuses.
yes. She's the only person on this stage who can tell us the square root of, I don't know, 4,300,000.
Not true.
So it's interesting, your question with regards to the sort of outsiderness of it. And having been born in this country, my parents were not. And my sense of and I have a very vivid sense of being the outsider as well as being the insider. But that outsiderness comes really from my parents' conception of the country. And so in a way, in trying to address your question, I think I probably would address it from their perspective as I imagine. And I think the country that they came to and that they were inspired by was a country which they did not feel was their country. I think they were very clear that there was a dominant majority, and that dominant majority had a culture. And it didn't like certain things, and that part of being a guest, if you will, in this country which they hoped was a country they would make their own and hoped they would someday understand. And it's I don't mean any disrespect to both of them who are no longer with us, to say that I don't think they ever really did. I'm not sure they ever really fully understood America. If any of us ever can. Well, I'm not sure in 2023 that anybody can. So I think that it would maybe not be such a surprise to my parents that there was I remember my father talking about the sort of, and my father, for those of you who read Homeland Elegies, the Trump of it all, whatever, notwithstanding, would talk about white rights and the sort of the idea that whites had some conception of the country that was theirs that they were trying to protect. And, he was very canny about all of that. So I think they wouldn't be surprised.
You mentioned the antebellum period, and you're a historian, and so I especially want to hear from you on this. I've been trying to place, we see throughout history and across the world, these sort of periods where freedom of expression feels more challenged, or book banning is more prevalent. And I've been thinking back, like, okay, is this like McCarthyism? Is this like these sort of obscenity trials in the '60s, like what, or antebellum South? What period does this most resemble to you? And is there something we can learn from it to get our way out of it?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't. There's something singular about this period. I mean, and I mean that in the sense that they're old battles, right, over who constitutes a legitimate part of the body politic. They're old battles over what people can learn and know and the like. But there's something particular about this moment and the kind of sort of the intensity of the hostility to knowledge for a significant sector of the society actually makes it very hard to have deep deliberation. And that feels like combined with the sort of hypermedia age and all of these sort of various vehicles for sort of misinformation and manipulation of information, it feels very hard to get to how you have the kind of sustained kind of engagement over the question about what kind of society ought we have, right? And there seems to be an element of sort of deep disingenuousness, and that's my perception from one side of the sort of political spectrum. So I don't know that it resembles. I mean, I think there are elements of McCarthyism. There's elements of the sort of post-civil rights moment and the backlash. There's elements of Jim Crow. There's there's elements of the nativism of the late 19th century. I mean, it's a stew of a lot of difficult stuff. Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned those sort of hyper-mediated age, and there also seems to be, to me, a series of really confusing contradictions baked in, and so we live in this age of an informational abundance, and yet there's this desire to suppress knowledge or erase or suppress history or ban books or et cetera. And then you look at people who maybe claim to be for freedom generally or for free speech, but in many cases those are the same people who are advancing campaigns to ban books, and so again a contradiction. And so I wonder, I mean, Ed, we've talked about this in terms of the informational environment we're all in, but I wonder to what extent is that a driver, the backdrop, like just the internet, like talk about sort of how that factors into all of this.
My apologies in advance for what I'm about to say.
I'm ready.
Which I obsess about this maybe more than I should, and maybe this is a sign I should not speak about this because this is, my mic is. As president of Penn, I spend a fair amount of time feeling frustrated by the dimming interest in free speech. It seems like everybody is interested in free speech to the extent that they want to allow the things that they want to hear. And the extent to which they are not interested in hearing something, they don't think that it's important to defend that speech. So if, one thing I've said is really striking to me of late is that it seems to me increasingly that folks are responding to language primarily to understand what your political affiliation is. And if they agree with the signified affiliation of your language, then they will take the meaning of your words seriously. But if they don't, if you somehow signal that what you are saying is some other point of view, then they will not even make the effort to understand what you're saying. And so I sort of bring this up just as a way of saying that I think there are deeper technological forces at work. I think that this manufactured group response in many cases is something that is resulting from a kind of centralization of power and a domination of the platforms and the devices on which free speech is increasingly happening. Public speech is increasingly a function of the capabilities 5 or 6 companies are offering us as a people.
And it's
private companies.
I feel the need to point this out because often you'll hear Elon Musk, for example, talk about being a free speech absolutist. He owns his platform and operates it at his whims.
Indeed. And Apple, the devices on which those things happen, and Google and the internet searches. It's not just the social media companies, it's the whole ecosystem, which has, for those of you who don't know, they operate on a model of monetized speech at scale.
Yeah.
So speech is monetized. Our speech is monetized when it is unfolding on one of these platforms or through these devices. And so a certain kind of speech is far more lucrative. That speech tends to be emotionally charged, and it tends to be politically polarizing, and it tends to be disinformation. So the scourge that we're dealing with is actually driven by economic incentive, fundamentally. That's the atmosphere that we are in because that's where our conversations are happening. And journalism increasingly seems to be downstream of the conversation that is happening in what we tend to think is a free and open space is anything but.
That's right.
It's owned by 6 companies. And those 6 companies, I was telling Adrienne earlier, the advents that are happening around AI have some sort of inside knowledge about what's going on at Microsoft. Microsoft is about to become the most powerful company in the history of the world by a factor of 10. More powerful than the British East Indian Company. And what are we doing to address that? We want to talk about what cultural things we don't like about each other, when in fact the real conversation to be had is, why are so few in power?
I want to go back to the social web. I'm also obsessed with this topic, but I first want to go to something you talked about a moment ago, which is this sort of the coded language or the kind of signals that people are listening for in order to decide if this person's part of my political tribe. And I'm curious for your views, Imani, because you're a professor at Harvard, and I have not been in college for a very long time. And so I'm curious to hear, there's so much debate over the sort of culture on college campuses and whether it's still conducive to free speech and, open intellectual inquiry. And I'm curious, I just want to hear, a report from the ground, what's actually happening from what you've seen.
Yeah, I think this point is really well taken, and before pivoting to that just for a moment, I think what's an interesting aspect of it is that because of the structure of our engagement with these media companies, oftentimes sort of these artifacts, right, function as proxies for our positions, and so we actually don't ever deliberate, right? We say this, right? There's people post something and say this, right? And so there's this representation of the self through, through these artifacts that actually, I think, exacerbates the problem. But so what's really interesting about the college campus thing is that it is wildly overstated that college campuses are bastions of liberalism. I will start by saying that. Wow, just not true at all. And I think that one of the things I actually find very encouraging from really young people is that the college age people, and my children are in that age group as well, is that they are actually, when we talk about them as sort of digital natives, they have a kind of an intensity of cynicism and skepticism that I think actually makes them much more sophisticated consumers often than people in my age group. And so in the classroom, there is quite a bit, and I would say especially compared to 10 years ago, I'm seeing students who are much more critical, even along the lines of their sort of ideological perspective. They're probing. And I think that's a pretty dramatic transition over the course of 10, 15 years, actually.
And do you see that just in the form of like skepticism, not
Everything they read, they are skeptical.
Okay, that is encouraging.
And very aware of sort of media consolidation and ownership and the way information is fed. I think that one of the things that becomes challenging, though, is that how do you go from skepticism to actually being serious students of the world, right? Because you have to make a decision about some things that you're going to be willing to take seriously and engage. But I'm actually much more optimistic about young people than I am about the rest of us.
Well, that's something. Okay, shifting gears from the young people and the colleges that aren't as bad as some might think, which is good news. I want to talk a little bit about the people who are pushing for the banning of books. And the question I have is naive, probably, and also will reveal my own views on this, but I'm trying to understand why someone would want the government to tell them what they can or can't read. Like it seems so outlandish to me, and so I'm curious for your views, both of you. Is this part of the larger sort of move toward authoritarianism? Is what is the underlying? Is it fear-based? I mean, Tony in his opening remarks talked about the fear that pushes people toward this kind of action. Obviously, bigotry, no question, in some cases. But if you were to sort of diagnose culturally what it is we're seeing and what's behind it, what's going on?
What do you think? I mean, I think it goes back to your earlier point about a certain kind of clannishness around ideas. So, I don't think that people want ideas that are consistent with what they believe to circulate, right? I think the larger question is, though, what does it mean to not be willing to have one's ideas contested and engage critically, right? That, to me, seems to be the crisis. But and I'll just say, is this one of the things that sticks in my craw. So often there are people that is perhaps sort of an unexpected position coming from me, or maybe not, but that people will say every time something comes, some kind of book banning or something bad comes out of the South, there are people who are sort of on the other side who say, oh, we should just cut off that part of the country and let them go. And I say, yeah, so that's not good. And there's actually there's a great novel by Catherine Lacey, biography of X, that actually plays with this idea. But I think that it has more to do with clannishness than it does seriously, but it is an indication of a kind of anti-intellectualism that I think has a kind of, that there's a fervor around that is deeply troubling, because any idea that you hold dearly, you ought to be willing to have it contested.
How about for you?
I don't know. It's interesting, sort of the granular process of what's happening in places like Florida, for example, where, one person is submitting hundreds and hundreds of titles to the board, and then those books are pulled off shelves, and then there's a review process. And sometimes that review process takes months, and sometimes it's not completed. And so the books are out of circulation. And, at Penn, we just sued in Escambia County to try to get some kind of a blueprint going in terms of how to push back against this. And because it's a model that you're now seeing in Texas and you're seeing in other states where one person is having this ridiculous outsized impact. And so it's a kind of an interesting, of course it is it's state power that is allowing this, but it's also one person, which is really surprising. I guess I don't want to say too much more than that. I do have a lot of thoughts about it. I think the pace of change is really extraordinary right now. And I think I do understand, even if I don't agree with it, I understand parents being worried about what it is their kids are being exposed to all the time, 24/7. I don't know that using state power to suppress ideas is a solution to that. So again, I have lots of thoughts. I don't think that they're they're not formulated enough for the New York Public Library yet. So.
Do you think that, I mean, I wonder to what extent that there's a displacement of anxieties, right, on the one hand, and then also I wonder if it's a distraction, right, but a distraction that has really pernicious effects, right? So we're going to focus on these books as opposed to think about all the other sort of social crises, but then it's not simply a distraction, right?
Right, like a way to direct one's energy, maybe.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, sorry, Adrienne,
No, please,
just to add to the point Imani's making, I think it is increasingly perceived as actually a losing issue on the Republican side, which is, I think, part of why DeSantis would come out and say, it's a hoax, this is not real, what's happening, because I think there is something unseemly about the idea of banning books for children and hurting libraries and all of that sort of thing. So it's part of the culture war that it seems like metastasizing, and I don't know what we do to stop it. We're doing our best at PEN America, but I don't know that there is as deep a support for it as we maybe perceive here in New York. I don't know that folks in Florida are as behind it as we might think.
Right, maybe not. But I'll point out too, though, that it's not talking critically about the government to have to register with the government. I mean, things you would think of as a journalist in America as totally unimaginable. So there is this larger cultural cause for concern, I think. I will say, though, Ad, I love that you started your answer to the last question with "I don't know," because something I've been thinking a lot about is, and again, this goes back to the social web and sort of this culture of charged emotional reactions and extreme certainty. And I have found that, and I've talked to many of my colleagues at The Atlantic about this as well, that it seems like there is less space for uncertainty and complexity and nuance. And you've mentioned multiple times now the spaces for deliberation, which is, I think, exactly what that is. Like the ability to not know, to change your mind, to consider something and then go back and forth, whatever the case. But I'm curious, I mean, I'd love to hear your views on that, again, in the context of whether it's the social web or the larger informational ecosystem. But are we having sort of also a crisis that may be related of lack of humility or overconfidence in our own opinions?
I don't know.
Now he's just going to say that to everything.
I really meant it that time. I love the work of Daniel Kahneman. Thinking Fast and Slow is one of my Bibles for playwriting. I think it's the best book about writing for an audience that I have ever come across. And it's about behavioral psychology. And people often ask Daniel Kahneman, after having spent years and years and years trying to understand the mind and understand bias and all of these things, like what have you learned? Like what do you know now? And his response is authentically Socratic, and he says, I know that whatever I think, I'm probably wrong. This is Daniel Kahneman.
Right.
I mean, if Daniel Kahneman's probably wrong, I'm definitely wrong. So I don't even remember what the question was anymore.
It was a good answer, regardless. Well, speaking of being wrong, or actually this is sort of a different kind of question, but you're both very accomplished, famous writers, and I'm curious, given the culture we're in, do you ever feel like there are things that you maybe would have written at an earlier time in your career that you now are disinclined to, or like, do you feel the chilling effect?
I wouldn't have a career today if I had started out. My first novel, and American Dervish, when it came out, was what I thought a very, very loving portrait of my community that I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and was not perceived by certainly that community as such, but also not by the larger Muslim American community in general. And then when Disgrace won the Pulitzer, droves and droves of sort of Muslim Americans came to theaters that they never went to. I remember I got the same letter over and over so many times. We were so proud. We bought tickets. My parents had never been to a theater. We went to see your play. And as we watched it, we were sickened and disgusted by what you were doing to us in front of them.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I got
Hard
that.
to receive
Oh my
over
God.
and over
Yeah,
and over.
It's been a, yeah. And so, if there had been sensitivity readers, and I don't mean to diminish the importance of a strong editorial voice in the process to help you get things right. But if there had been sensitivity readers at my publisher or at the theaters that I was starting out in, I have no doubt that folks would be like, you know what? Because the thing is, they programmed and published some of this stuff because they thought, oh, we're going to reach those people. But it turns out the stuff I'm writing, which is an attempt to try to tell the truth about, it's like Czeslaw Milosz once said about a writer's born into a family, and that family's finished. Right? So, and then Philip Roth quoted him for, 30 years. If writer's born into a community, that community is put on notice. I don't see the writer or the artist's job as one of public relations or to make folks look good or to advertise for an identity or a cause. I see writing and art as having a higher calling. So I have no question I would not have a career.
Did that experience change what you feel like you can write now?
Oh, God. Yeah, I struggle with it. I'd like to say no. And I'm as a theater artist who relishes the preview process in which I sit with the audience for 3 weeks on Broadway, and I hear and I make changes that night, and then we have rehearsal in the afternoon, then we do a new performance, and we get this time as playwrights. I'm very sensitive to the feedback that comes. So I'm writing to the present. I'm writing to the audience as they are now. So I have to be calibrated to what transgressions will be meaningful, because I think there's a point now where we are where some transgressions would not be meaningful, actually. They would just be disqualifying. So I don't want to transgress, because of course I have to transgress. That's my job. But I have to transgress in a way that is still hearable.
Right. I want to go back to writing for a live audience, but first I want to hear from you. Are there things from earlier in your career that you wrote that you feel like you couldn't today, or things you feel like you're afraid to write now?
Yeah, no, I think actually for me, less than the time period, it's age that makes me feel that it's increasingly important to tell the truth as I see it in a more sort of unapologetic fashion. But I do think this question about being right is really interesting, because as an academic, right, so much of what you write is about being right? You're supposed to, you set forth an argument, you corral your evidence, and you make the claim that you think of as sort of largely impenetrable, and you're always wrong about that, but that's what you're trying to do. And that for me, the transition to thinking of writing much more as art, or wanting to pursue it more as art, is actually about wanting to be less oriented towards being right and more oriented towards truth, which is, I think, which is an invitation to a kind of engagement that doesn't necessarily lay claim to the authority of being right, but actually it's based upon what you share being something that can resonate, both intellectually and emotionally. And so what has been fascinating to me is having people who clearly disagree with much of what I am saying find themselves in the things that I write. And that's actually, for me, that's the aspiration, because that then becomes a space for engagement. Right, and I keep talking about deliberation, but I actually think that in some ways is the core of the sort of ideal of democracy, is to be able to engage, to have those sort of deep conversations. So I think that feels particularly urgent for me now. Yeah.
Going back to this question about, for you as a playwright, as writers, for all three of us, I think so much of the response you're getting to your work is necessarily online. I mean, you might receive nice comments from people or whatever, or mean comments, either way. But largely you're seeing your work and your thoughts and your ideas filtered through kind of like the scary sausage machine of the internet. And so I'm curious, given that, for your work, when you're doing watching a live audience react to it, what is it that you're noticing that's different? Not just, I mean, of course it's a product of the medium and you can't disentangle that, but is there some sort of face-to-face magic that we can learn from as we're trying to create a better, more deliberative society?
I was totally with you in that question until you said that we can learn from. I have no idea.
Or that we should avoid.
Yeah, but what I can share what my experience is.
Yeah.
Which is that it's really quite a remarkable thing to sit with an audience with a work that you've created, knowing that there are certain things that need to happen. They need to understand certain plot points. They need to understand certain nuances. There need to be certain silences in which they are moved. They need to laugh at the jokes. Your jokes have to be funny enough to make them laugh. And so when they don't, you know that the joke is not working. So then you have to rewrite it. And that kind of real-time data is just, it's very different than what you're talking about with the internet. Mm-hmm. There have been studies that have been done about audiences, and it turns out that live audiences' heartbeat often synchronizes during a performance.
Is that really, that's so nice. Is that really true?
You can look it up.
I'm going to look it up.
Poetic.
Atlantic fact checkers, beware.
We're on it.
And that's just a kind of validation of something that I think theater artists know, which is that the audience has a unified experience. And the thing that I have found and continue to find fascinating, perplexing, and I don't think there's a solution to it, but maybe it does kind of signal this divide between the internet and live reality, which is that I know when a play is working, or when a section of a play is working, I know the audience is having exactly the same experience, all of them. They're all having the same experience. What they say about that experience is about what language and ideas they have brought to the play and which they leave with. And so the reflexive or the reflective aspect of talking about meaning as opposed to the actual experience of what was happening, which they were all having the same experience. That to me is a fascinating divide, and I would love to live in the first part and not have to deal with the second part, but I'm a working writer, so.
Right. I want to go back to the looking at sort of some of the culture behind some of the sort of book banning or erasure of history or reluctance to, be straightforward about facts. And thinking about the teaching of history in particular in states like Texas comes to mind, where some of the standards that have been established or tried to be established are about avoiding discomfort or feelings of guilt on behalf of the students. And I'm thinking of this because you're describing this emotional experience that people have when they're, collectively absorbing a work of art or a play or whatever. And I'm curious for Imani maybe first, but both of you, to talk about what does it mean for us as a society if we believe that part of education should be to avoid those feelings?
I mean, it would mean that no black children go to school ever. But I think the larger, I'm really fascinated by that line of thought because it assumes such a narrow potential for the moral imaginations of white children, right? So that it should be the case that every child can encounter a history, right, or text, and find themselves capable of identifying with anybody in that text, right? I mean, I think that's that's fundamentally human. So first I was like, why would you imagine that the white child cannot identify with the people who are struggling to be free from slavery, or would not identify with the Japanese Americans interned, right? I find that a really troubling formulation, that there's this sort of one-to-one identity correlation with history and self, right? I don't think that's true. And then I thought, well, of course it's not true, and maybe that's the source of the fear, that actually everybody will identify with the cause of the people who have been suffering, that's really the source of the fear, and and then you really get the potential for social transformation. And then it began to make more sense to me why people were trying to prevent prevent them, because it's very easy for a difficult history to be stigmatizing as well, right? But there's something about the nature of storytelling that I think is happening now. It's just such a beautiful kind of flourishing of all kinds of different storytelling, that people are actually capable of deep identification across lines of difference and transformation through that. And that, in fact, is what terrifies many people in the society.
That's fascinating and very smart, and I want to sort of expand it into a writing context, because there's also this debate sometimes on the writing side when you talked about sort of the one-to-one representation, a failure of imagination for what's possible and for people to empathize with. And I was talking to a novelist recently who was lamenting sort of this culture where, while obviously we need to all work harder to have more representation of writers of all different backgrounds, writing great works of, whatever kind of writing. But he was worried that, this pressure is potentially being taken to the point that it's like, well, you're a woman, you can't write about a man's perspective as a novelist, or you're whatever identity you are, and therefore you can't, it's not your place to write about this. And so I wonder how you think about it, both of you, in those terms. I mean, should there be, what do you make of this sort of pressure or constraints on the writer for what they, especially in the context of novelists, for what is permissible for them to imagine in their own writing and characters based on their identity? You talked about this a little bit earlier.
Sure. I mean, that's a very carefully worded question.
What did I do?
I mean, you're being very careful about it, and I totally understand.
Right.
But let's not be careful about this. And I want to go back briefly to the question around harms, the harms of speech. I don't, and having had to sit with this question very deeply for 3 years, as an artist who, frankly, I don't want to have an opinion about stuff. Like, it's a liability to me to have a politics. It prevents me from being able to see people of different, the writer I admire the most, Shakespeare, the one who I learned from every day, you wouldn't know if he was Catholic or Protestant. You wouldn't know if he was a monarchist. You wouldn't know if he was he was against the king. He writes from every point of view, and he writes beautifully from every point of view. But having to sit with this question for 3 years as president of Penn, I don't think as important as the harms of speech, the alleged harms of speech may be, they do not have an equal claim as the freedom to speak and the freedom of the imagination. This was really brought home for me after the attack on Salman, because I grew up in a community, very conservative Muslim community in Milwaukee, where the satanic verses exploded like a mortar shell in the middle of the community, and there was so much anger about what Salman had done and what he had written, and of course, a Western audience can't understand that. Right. They can't understand why Muslims would be why we were so upset. He was saying things about the Prophet and about us that the West had been saying for 300 years to justify all kinds of horrible stuff. And here Salman is now siding with those motherfuckers and saying all this stuff about us and the Prophet. He deserves what he's getting. That's how the folks in my community felt. And I totally got it. I was 18, and I totally got it. I totally understood. The harms in that instance led to real harm. People died. And then I read the book. I read it a year later. And it totally transformed me. I gave a speech about this at some point, and I'm going to quote myself, though it's, of course, not, it's gauche to do so, but I can't come up with a better line.
At least you're admitting it.
Can't come up with a better line than I said, in the speech I said that Kafka once wrote that literature is the axe for the frozen sea inside us. And when it was when I read the Satanic Verses that I first heard that seismic cracking sound of hundreds of years of frozen things breaking open inside me.
That was worth requoting.
Absolutely.
And that transgression, that historical transgression, that willingness to offend, to cause harm is central to the movement of knowledge and the possibility for advancement, whether it's scientific or human. So the harm, the argument that I don't want my child reading a book about Black history because it is harmful to my white identity, or that I don't want to read a book that is anti-whatever identity that is marginalized because I will feel harmed by that, is the same argument. And it's disqualifying on both sides.
I want to go to Q&A. Thank you all for your questions. Before I do, I'm going to ask an oversimplified question of both of you, so forgive me. But if you had to plot yourself on a spectrum from, against free speech, like pro-book banning, to like total free speech absolutism, I mean, what you just said sounds pretty close to like total free speech.
I just worry that there are not 100 ways to parse this. Either we're going to stand for free speech or we're not. And it's not that there are not situations. Look, incitement to violence is part of what is not protected in the First Amendment. So the question of violence and harm is embedded in the question. But it becomes too easy to make that argument at convenience, even not out of convenience, but out of a sense of feeling besieged. It's not enough. It's not enough to say you cannot say those things because they harm me.
How about for you on my oversimplified spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I think here's why it's hard for me to sort of answer that question alone. I mean, I think in the abstract, yes, right? But we think about the First Amendment, it's a protection against, or it's a protection of the freedom of speech against governmental intrusion, which by its very structure is about power, right? So we think even of the example of sort of who can write about what or which identities. And I would never suggest that anybody should be prohibited about writing about anything or having any perspective, but it would be false to suggest that there is an equal point of access to telling one's story, right? And so part of the history that people are responding to, and it's a really bad shorthand by saying, oh, you're not supposed to write about this, is that, well, people like you write about me all the time and I don't get to write about you, or I don't get to write about myself, right? And that's a power question. That's not a question, right? So absolutely, I think anybody should have access to write or talk about anything. But the problem is that there is an incredible imbalance of power when it comes to whether we're talking about the publishing industry, whether we're talking about access to the kind of institutions, governmental institutions, various other kinds of educational institutions, right, where a variety of perspectives can be shared. And so for me, I can't divorce the question from inequality. So yes, I'm supportive free, but maybe for me the best way to think about it is, I really am interested in freedom of discourse, right? Because there's one thing to be able to say whatever you want to say, but then the question is, well, who gets to answer back? Can you have a conversation? And oftentimes there are much larger voices that are unwilling to have the conversation.
Right.
And which, just to piggyback off that, brings us back to that conversation about centralized power and 6 companies that are shaping
Absolutely.
Discourse in the public sphere and are transforming our cognition.
Right. Okay, your questions. Thank you again. So the first one is, the panel is talking as if all the books are being banned by conservatives. What about the books being removed/banned and altered by liberals? For example, quote unquote, racist books being quietly removed. Or I'm going to add to this person's question with apologies. Hopefully I'm picking up on what you're asking, but you look at like the Balderization of Roald Dahl, or we see that sort of thing. What do you think?
I mean, I think I answered it with my last question.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's goofy to change books, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually insulting, I think, to people who actually want to have serious conversations about the history of race and inequality, to just think we're going to paper over it. And I think it's a decision that's more than anything is about marketing and book sales, and not really about political perspective.
And also just like deeply Orwellian. Okay.
That too.
Next question. To to what degree do you think writers are self-censoring due to the atmosphere currently prevailing?
I mean, I think it's without question we're self-censoring. Chimamanda has been very eloquent on this. But, you know, the question is, do we or do we not always figure out what is permissible and not permissible to say within any society? And where does that line begin to feel like it's having a chilling effect on creativity? And where is that line actually a prompt to saying something interesting by finding a historical antecedent or speaking about something in an indirect way?
I'm going kind of rapid fire because I want to get to as many of these as we can, and we're almost out of time. I really like this question. What is something that those of us pushing back against the control of knowledge get wrong in our approach?
I'll say this. I do believe, of course, it's important to, you know, fight at the level of the school board and the library and absolutely support people who are working in those institutions. But there's something that is, I think, really sort of valiant about the sort of everyday resistance of reading the books anyway, of deciding that we're going to gather and talk about these ideas anyway, and sort of I think sometimes the sort of sky is falling response actually makes us forget the kind of power that there exists in insurgency as a reaction, right? So that if it's just the question, oh, it's banned, but okay, so but what do we do on a daily basis? We read the books, we talk about them. Right? We show up with them. Yeah.
This is going to be the last question, and it's related, but adds another dimension, which is within the limitations of a monetized, algorithmically driven ecosystem, what can readers and writers and independent publishers do to maintain freedom of speech and defend access to unauthorized ideas? So in other words, sort of similar, okay, if we're going to read the books to fight against people who might ban them, what do we do to fight back against this informational environment that is suboptimal, at the very least?
It's a daily question for me. I feel like it begins at home, and I think it begins with some kind of cognitive hygiene, and I don't know any other way to make my way. I mean, I know you're working on a piece that's going to try to articulate the larger vision of.
Don't talk about it yet.
I won't say what it is, but the larger vision that we're dealing with. Yeah. And I think we need people thinking about how to understand the way that Marx helped us to understand the Industrial Revolution's transformation of society and family and gave voice to the proletariat in a way. We need to understand today there's a different narrative. There's a different structure of power that is disenfranchising all of us, irrespective of political point of view. That's why the conversation around politics, while important, is not where it's really happening. Follow the money, that's where it's happening. So I don't remember the question, but yeah.
No, you did great.
This is what happens to me. I get off on these things.
That cognitive hygiene, that's chef's kiss.
Cognitive hygiene and read the books. Those are my two takeaways here.
Can I say one thing
Please.
about Penn? So we just today announced that Imani has this amazing news today and yesterday, and we in Miami we just opened a chapter, and 20 best-selling authors, everybody from Michael Connelly to Nora Roberts and
Judy
Bloom donated a lot of money to open a chapter in Florida, really to begin to push back locally in a much more robust way. So you can go to Penn. You can go to penn.org and please take a look at what we're doing and donate if you can.
Well, and just coming out and having this conversation with us gives me cause for optimism. And I just want to thank you both so much for joining us, and to all of you, and especially to New York Public Library for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.